War. A brutal strategic clash where the strongest forces emerge victorious. But what if I told you that one of the most lopsided defeats in military history didn't involve humans at all? In 1932, the Australian government armed itself with machine guns and declared war against emus. Yes, actual birds. The plan? Eradicate thousands of these oversized, flightless invaders before they devoured Australia's farmland. The result? A battlefield humiliation so absurd, so astonishing, that it sounds like satire. Australian soldiers unleashed relentless firepower, expecting a swift victory. But the emus had other plans: outrunning bullets, dodging gunfire, and even coordinating evasive maneuvers. These birds made the Australian army look like amateurs in their own backyard. What was supposed to be a straightforward mission quickly spiraled into an all-out disaster. But how did a fully armed military lose to a bunch of birds? Why is this bizarre battle still talked about nearly a century later? Or maybe the real question is, why haven't you heard of it at all? Buckle up, because we're about to dive into one of the most absurd, hilarious, and utterly unbelievable wars in history, the Great Emu War. To understand how this all began, we need to rewind to the early 1930s, a time when Australia was facing a perfect storm of economic and environmental chaos. The Great Depression had left thousands of farmers barely scraping by, struggling to make ends meet. Banks were collapsing, jobs were disappearing, hunger was widespread. And in Western Australia, things were even worse. Years earlier, the government had encouraged World War I veterans to take up farming in the vast, open lands of the West. Promises were made: free land, financial security, a new life. But as wheat prices plummeted, farmers found themselves drowning in debt, with no government aid in sight. And then came the emus. Not a handful, not a few hundred. Over 20,000 of them. Picture this. You've just spent months planting and caring for your wheat fields, hoping to make a living in these harsh conditions, when suddenly a horde of 6-foot-tall, 100-pound, sprinting birds descend upon your crops like an unstoppable force of nature. To the emus, the freshly planted wheat fields were the equivalent of an all-you-can-eat buffet. To the farmers, it was an apocalyptic nightmare. At first, farmers tried to handle the problem themselves. They built fences, but emus either trampled through them or jumped over them. They tried using dogs, but the dogs were often too scared to face a full-grown emu head-on. They shot at them with rifles, but they couldn't reload fast enough before the next wave of birds flooded in. Day by day, the farms were disappearing. Entire wheat fields were flattened, stripped bare by thousands of relentless, hungry emus. As the situation spiraled out of control, farmers banded together and demanded government intervention. They needed a solution. And what they got was a declaration of war. By November 1932, the Australian Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce, made it official. The military would deploy soldiers to Western Australia. They would be armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their mission? Eradicate as many emus as possible. This was no joke. The Australian government was literally sending troops to wage war against birds, and the press had a field day. Newspapers ran absurd headlines, openly mocking the idea of trained soldiers chasing birds through the outback. Cartoonists had a goldmine of material depicting the Australian military engaged in a full-scale, tactical battle against emus. Some people thought this was satire. Others assumed it was some kind of government prank. But this wasn't a joke. The Australian military was genuinely preparing for battle. On November 2, 1932, Major G.P.W. Meredith led a team of 2 soldiers into the wheat fields, accompanied by their Lewis machine guns and a literal military truck. The strategy seemed simple. Find a flock of emus, set up machine guns, eliminate the threat. Sounds straightforward, right? It wasn't, because emus, as it turns out, are absolute units. Attempt number 1 was the ambush fail. Soldiers found a group of 50 emus. They opened fire. The birds scattered in all directions. Only a handful were hit. Attempt number 2, the trap disaster. They tried herding the emus into a kill zone. They quickly learned, emus don't herd. They scattered again. The third attempt? The machine gun chase. Soldiers mounted an actual machine gun on the back of a truck. They chased the emus across the outback. The truck bounced uncontrollably over rough terrain. The gunner missed every single shot. Then the truck broke down. At this point, it was official. The emus were winning. As the battles raged on, reports emerged suggesting that the emus were adapting. They moved in organized formations. When a leader bird fell, another took its place. They zigzagged unpredictably, making them nearly impossible to hit. Major Meredith later lamented to reporters, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." Even the soldiers themselves had to admire their feathery foes. After weeks of humiliation, the results were in. 2,500 rounds of ammunition had been fired. Emus killed? About 200. Emus still alive? Over 19,800. On December 10, 1932, the Australian government withdrew its troops from battle. The Emu Army had won the war. The Great Emu War instantly became one of history's most laughable military blunders. The Australian government was ridiculed internationally. Newspapers mocked the failure for months. Historians still reference it as one of the strangest conflicts ever recorded. Today, the Great Emu War has been referenced in films, books, and documentaries, turned into internet memes, and celebrated as one of Australia's quirkiest historical moments. So, what can we learn from the Great Emu War? Nature always finds a way to win. Just because you have machine guns doesn't mean you'll win a war. And sometimes, birds are smarter than humans. If you enjoyed this hilarious deep dive into one of history's greatest blunders, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Because history is full of absurd, unbelievable, and downright ridiculous stories. And we'll be back to bring you more. Stay curious, stay entertained.